Hey y'all, we are live. Welcome to another episode of Poly Side Eye with me and Jared. And today's conversation is about all these I cursed already. Anyway, of these executive orders. Um, as recently, I saw Google change the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. Such an important executive order with all that's going on right now. But we got something done, I guess. But yeah, what do you have to say on all of these things happening?
So obviously there's been a flurry of executive orders. This actually isn't like out of the ordinary. Like most presidents, when they first, I would say in the last like 20 years or so, as Congress has gotten much more, dysfunctional, presidents have relied much more on executive orders to try to get things done, especially things that their key constituents want. So this isn't like there's a lot of publicity around it, but it's not necessarily out of the ordinary. But there's two sets of executive orders that I found the most interesting, and also I don't know if you've heard about this new called Department of Government Efficiency. D.O.G.E, as it were. So this is, which was also created via executive order. So like I've been focusing mainly on that and these executive orders around DEI, because that seems to have gotten a lot of people in a tizzy. And so yeah, I just wanted to try to get a sense of like what was going on based on like how I understood it. So
right. So that new organization, what is it called again? The
Department of Government Efficiency. That's what it stands for. Let me double check.
And it's ran by Elon Musk.
Yeah, Department of Government Efficiency. So department is a bit of a misnomer, because it's not like a department in the sense that it's been most departments like the Department of Education, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera, you have to get congressional approval to get those established. So because it's not like a formal government department, like it's limited in like what it can do in terms of like actually affecting change. But what they've been doing is essentially trying to see how far they can go, which they know it's gonna like generate all types of like legal actions, which it has. But they're essentially testing the water to see like how far they can go within the bounds of an executive order. So like executive orders aren't laws. So when the next president comes in, he or she or they or whatever can like get rid of every existing executive order before that. So like they're not constitutionally bound. And so like there's also like a very clear limitation as to like what they can accomplish. And so the way I tend to think of executive orders is not like it's not like an instant thing. To me, what it's trying to do is essentially shift the discourse around a given like policy or initiative or aim or something like that. So on one hand, like we should be kind of glad that this is the route they're taking, because like a lot of the things they're doing could in theory be reversed, or they could just not be adhered to. So like there's a lot of gray area with executive orders, but presidents use them because think their president is Superman, so like we want them to do everything, and like we they kind of rely on that as a way to like signal that they are like committed to whatever they're
because from my perspective, it just looks like, I'm just wondering how much power does this have? Because of the current person in the White House, it just seemed like they're just waving a wand. Okay, executive order for this, executive order for this. This is going to happen. I'm just wondering, like, can this be reversed? Like, can he do this? It's just giving real king-like stuff.
So yeah, so again, every president when they get in office, every president really in the last the last 20 to 30 years, because and we'll get into this when we talk about those more, but like essentially because it's so hard to get any type of legislation passed, what presidents have been doing is relying again on these executive orders, which they can do kind of at their own behest. But again, there's limitations as to like how these things are funded, or like how do you actually like make sure that people are adhering to these orders or whatever. Like again, they're not laws, so like there isn't a kind of a structural basis for these things. A lot of it is just signaling. It's signaling to people like your ideas, and again, trying to shift kind of the discourse around a lot of things. And so maybe we should talk about the DEI one first, because I think that's the one that's kind of like gotten people in a tizzy.
Yeah.
So on Trump's first day, he signed an executive order. I can't remember the exact precise name of it, but essentially it was like ending DEI initiatives in government. So this is the other thing. Executive orders typically only refer to or only apply or applicable to government agencies and companies that contract with the government. So like oftentimes they're not directly applicable to private firms, unless again they have they're doing direct business with government. Now America increasingly has become, it's kind of hard to detach like private industry from government now, because the state and capital are so like intertwined. So a lot of times private companies will in fact adhere to the executive orders because they don't want to, face lawsuit. But there is again a little bit of gray area there. But so essentially that order immediately ended any type of claims to end any type of like DEI initiatives within government and companies that contract with government. Now, the more interesting executive order, and I actually just wrote about this I'm doing an edited chapter in Routledge. So Routledge is like it's like a book publisher, mainly academic, but they do some like public facing stuff too. But like they're putting together a reader on anti-racism in the United States over time. And so I wrote a chapter in this edited volume that's going to come out later this year about, how people have understood racial equality since the civil rights movement ended, so to speak. So like since the late 60s. And so what I argue in that is that, there's a very clear kind of tension in the idea of equality of opportunity, that people differ on like what that means. And so like the idea, like what does equality of opportunity mean? And so I think one way you see this come through is that people often say equality, but then they say equity. And so my students do this as well. And I'm always asking them, anytime they write equity in their paper, I'm going to circle it and I'm going to ask them to define what they mean by that, because a lot of that is like taken for granted, but like I don't think we can take it for granted, because what did the Civil Rights what did the Civil Rights Act aim to do? Like what did affirmative action aim to do? When affirmative action was first kind of proposed, what it was trying to do was, so affirmative action, the first executive order that kind of used that language of affirmative action was by Kennedy in I think 1962. Or maybe 1961. And in that executive order, essentially what he said was that government agencies need to take affirmative action to ensure that people who have been discriminated against in the past, that we essentially take affirmative action in making sure that they're included in kind of the functions of government. So what he meant by that, this is the key point. He says without regard to their race, gender, etc. So like what they understood affirmative action as being is like getting rid of racial classification altogether, because their understanding was that race was inherently tied to racism. And so like, as long as you could identify somebody as Black or not white, essentially, you were going to be discriminated against. So the idea was like, get rid of that. So that was the original intent of affirmative action. And then in 1965, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, his successor, authorized another executive order in which he kind of expanded that a little bit, to essentially say that not only should Black people or like these, people who are, a part of populations that have historically been discriminated against, not only is it enough to get rid of these like classifications, but again, we also have to like actively try to ensure that we are essentially, again, including people into the government apparatus and in these jobs and stuff. But where it got hairy is that he gave a speech about this, in which at Howard University, incidentally, And in the speech, which was called to fulfill these rights, and you can Google the speech, it's all public knowledge. So in the speech, he essentially says that, you know, at one point we understood equality of opportunity as essentially getting rid of the chains that people had on, like, placed on them, but that's not enough. We need equality of not only equality of opportunity, but equality as a result. Now, it's one thing to say that people have an opportunity, and it's another thing to say that, you know, we have to ensure that there's equality in like outcomes. And so that incited a whole flurry of like legal kind of back and forth around like, okay, what does this mean? Like, does this mean we need to, you know, make sure there's no racial disparities? Now, they didn't use that language. What they used at the time was racial balance. So they were like, is it the case that every institution should be like reflective of the racial demographics of the society? Or does that just mean we can't have like discriminatory policies in the books? Never was clear. So like on one hand, the Supreme Court was like, well, you know, trying to achieve racial balance was okay. This is in a decision called Swan versus Mecklenburg County Schools. And then later in 1978, in another decision, they were like, no, you can't achieve racial balance because that undermines meritocracy. So like, you can't do that. So like over the last 50 years, the Supreme Court has been unclear about like what they mean by opportunity. What does equality mean? They don't really use the word equity. That kind of came later. But I say all that to say, if you read the executive order that Trump signed, essentially what it says is we're reverting back to the original meaning of affirmative action, which is we'll just have anti-discrimination policy, but we're not taking into account people's racial status, which, funny enough, this actually was the liberal position in the early 60s, which is, again, this idea that classifying people by race was inherently racist. And like you could never overcome racism as long as you were classifying people by race. And so I think what's going on now is like we're essentially litigating a lot of these same debates that were had back in like the 60s and 70s about, you know, what is the nature of racism and like this question of meritocracy, which we've talked about before. Like we know that America isn't meritocratic in the sense that people don't get what they get necessarily because of what they do. But like, I don't know if we know what to do with that. Like if we know that we don't have meritocracy in fact, but we still speak as though we believe it to be an important ideal, then like how do you square that circle? And so like to me, that's the way I kind of read Trump's executive order. Now some people will just say like Trump is trying to bring back Jim Crow, and I'm like, okay, like that's not, I don't think that's a really helpful, like a really useful reading of the situation if you're trying to actually understand the legal implications. But I mean, if that's what you think, then I mean, maybe he is. I don't know. But
does it present a gray area? Kind of. It just seems like a gray area is presented. Like, should race? I mean, I feel like race does matter these days. So I don't know.
The question is like, how does it matter? So like, this is where it got really tricky because again, in a very short span of time, and when the paper is published, I'll share it with everybody because I think it's a pretty good paper. But you know, and I'm not usually one to like toot my own horn about these things, but I spent a lot of time in the last few months really reading a lot of these Supreme Court decisions to get a sense of what they were trying to do. In the 1978 decision, again, it's called D.O.G.E versus the University of California system. So like to give a very short background on that, like essentially what happened was that in the, I think I've talked about this before. So in the 70s, there was a guy named Alan D.O.G.E, white guy who applied for admission, I want to say into Berkeley Medical School, and Berkeley Medical School had what they called at the time set-asides. And so what they did was they were like, okay, we're admitting, let's say 100 people. We want to make sure that at least like 8 people are Black, at least like 15 people are like essentially making sure it reflected the kind of demographic breakdown of the country. And after like what D.O.G.E did was like he sued on the grounds that he wasn't admitted, although some of the people who were admitted had lower like test scores and grades or whatever than he did. And so he argued in the grounds of like essentially reverse discrimination. And the Supreme Court actually, it was a very contentious debate. Like there were like every Supreme Court justice had a different interpretation of like what this meant. But the decision that ended up being the majority opinion was won by Lewis Powell, who was on the Supreme Court at the time. And what he said was that, well, you can't have set-asides, you can have quotas, but what you can do is you can take race into account for the purposes of diversity, because diversity is important for the state has a compelling interest in maintaining diversity, because essentially in this globalized economy, you want to make sure that you know how to like sell things to Black people and sell things to like you need to know how to relate to people, so you can make sure that you can sell things to them, because that's the only way you can like have, you know, a robust capitalist economy. And so like he was supportive of diversity to the extent that it helped to maintain the legitimacy of capitalism. So that's the kind of the whole edifice that diversity, equity, inclusion is like kind of rests upon. But what complicating it further was that Obama in 2011, I believe it was, passed an executive order explicitly like implementing or charging or telling people, government agencies, that they should you know, adopt practices towards the aims of like diversity, equity, inclusion. But he says that can only be done to the extent that meritocracy isn't undermined. So again, there's this tension between, you know, what does diversity mean really, and how do you do that when government again is like explicitly saying that meritocracy has to come first. So again, there's these tensions here that we don't want to think about it because it's too gray, it's too messy, and I think we want a clear answer, but there isn't a clear answer, and that's the source of politics. There is no clear answer with respect with these things.
Before we move on, can you just give me your definition of like equality versus equity?
So I don't really use equity, so I can't really give you my definition of equity, but I can give you what I think people mean by that. So okay, to cite this paper again, which I might post it on my website as a working paper. We'll see. But anyway, so I argue that there's like since the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement was interesting in the sense that there was a very clear understanding that as long as you had discrimination, like however you conceive of equality would never be realized as long as you had Black people being like overtly discriminated against. So there was some consensus. There was consensus on that. But after that, like there was no clear consensus as to like what qualified as equality. So I argue that there's been kind of three conceptions of equality. So I say there's colorblind democracy, which is the idea that equality means not having any arbitrary means of like of sorting people into certain jobs, schools, or whatever. So like you can't arbitrarily, because of someone's racial status, their gender, whatever, sexual orientation, like you can't discriminate against them. And if you don't have that discriminatory barrier, then people can compete like on equal terms. So that's colorblind democracy. Now, granted, people will say, well, we live in a class society, so like obviously some people, but the thing is, the Supreme Court repeatedly said that this does not apply to we live the understanding being like, yes, we live in a class society, so you should already know like there's going to be wealth inequality. So like we can't do anything about that because this is the world we have. And so they take capitalism for granted and all of the inequalities that comes with that. And so their thing is like, we just need to make sure that everybody can compete. Now, if you can't compete and beat the wealthy person, then too bad, too sad, but you can't blame it on racism. So that's one idea. The second, I argue, is like this concept of racial democracy. So this is different in the sense that people who cling to this kind of idea is like, well, we're never going to get rid of like wealth inequality. So like what we need to do is make sure there's no racial disparities or there's parity between the races at the level of like the racial group. So like if Black people make up 13% of the population, they need to make up 13% of the CEOs, 13% of the students admitted into college, 13% of the people in jail, 13% of, essentially they accept that the structure of our society can't change. And so like, you just need to make sure that there's no, again, disparities within kind of things. So that's the second. And then the third I argue is social democracy, in which these are people who usually advocate for some type of socialism or a reorganization of the way the economy is structured, because they argue that you can't really do anything about racial inequalities as so long as they are kind of embedded in a political economy that produces inequality. So even like MLK, like we talk about Martin Luther King, like he was just some like, you know, milquetoast liberal, but like MLK was pretty much a socialist at the time he was, you know, that word that I can't say. So, I mean, if you read MLK's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, he's like explicitly endorsing socialism. Like he doesn't really use the term because he's aware of the environment that he's in and how people think about that word. But essentially, all of the policies and initiatives he's advocating for are very much socialist in nature. And so that's the third view. And so I would say your definition of equality is going to vary. And so I would say equality means trying to overcome institutions, processes that produce inequality between people, kind of in themselves. Whereas equity to me implies like, we know there's going to be inequality, but like we can't do anything about that. So just make sure that Black people can get their slice of the pie. And what I've always argued is that, well, that's really not going to be able to happen because, as I've said before in here, like Black people kind of missed the window. Like really the most egalitarian period in American history was between like the end of the Second World War up until like the early 70s. In you know, it sucks, but like Black people were by and large the ones who were least able to take advantage of like this period of prosperity. And I think for a lot of Black people, they think that that's unjust, and it is. But I don't think there's anything. I don't think you can litigate that. You can't litigate the past. So like, I know people want to like. Oh, this is the other thing I say. Like people who want to eradicate racial disparities are much more focused on like what's called reparative justice, reparation. So like trying to make amends for unjust politics in the past, and I sympathize with that. But because I understand the nature of our United States' political economy and capitalism, I just don't see how that's possible. And so like part of the reason I personally am a socialist is because I recognize that really the only way to improve the lives of most Black people is by reorganizing the economy in a way that doesn't make Black people, poor, essentially. Right. And so it just kind of depends where you stand. There's no right or wrong answer on these things. So like, if you are like, I want I can't tell you you're wrong for feeling that way. It's just people have different ideas about these things. And to me, politics in these executive orders, especially around DEI, is just to me opening a long-standing debate about these things.
Right. I wanted to highlight this comment because that's just how I felt. Is equitable distribution attainable in a capitalistic society?
No, because capitalism requires, again, it's not about people being evil or greedy. Yes, people are evil and greedy, but like, what is capital? Like what people, I think of capital as like a thing, but capital really is about labor, human labor, in appropriating people's labor for the purposes of producing commodities. And so like, if you go to, when you get a new job, like what does it say in that contract? It's essentially saying that this employer is going to pay you a wage so that you can produce for them for a set amount of time, and then they'll appropriate what it is that you produce. So like you are agreeing to produce for other people. Like that's what your you won't read. We don't read it because it's like hundreds and hundreds of pages. But like at the core, like that's what you're agreeing to. So like you are agreeing to sell your labor to someone, in this case a corporation, an entity, a firm, what have you, in exchange for a wage. But of course that wage can't be, you have to produce more than what you're getting paid for, because if you don't actually, if you were paid fairly, if you were actually given, if your wage actually paid out what you produce, like essentially the capitalist economy would self-destruct, because the whole idea is that, well, we have to pay people less than what they produce because in theory, will take some of that and like invest it and like grow the business or whatever. Now, that was a very specific understanding of capitalism at a certain time in like the 17th century. So now what happens is we pay you less, take it, invest it. But by invest it, we really mean just like buy real estate or like get some passive income. So it's a little different now, but like that's the idea. And so like, no, you can't really have, if by equity you mean everyone essentially has a even share of what's being produced, no, you can't have that under capitalism, because it not because we're not trying hard enough, but because it by definition is not how that's not how you organize the economy under capitalism. It requires inequality, and inequality is, if you read a lot of the kind of the early literature on like when capitalism was first kind of emerging, that was actually viewed as kind of people understood that was a problem that you had to deal with. Well, eventually this is going to get to the point to where the economy is going to polarize, in the sense that you're going to have more and more poor people and more people who accumulate what's being produced from other people, and it's going to create all sorts of dysfunction. So we've come up with all sorts of ways to try to deal with that: welfare states, progressive taxation, deregulation, you name it. But like none of that, those things might work for a little while, but eventually they run their course because they don't deal with the core issue, which is the organization itself.
Okay. Well, moving on to the Department of Government Efficiency. And also, y'all, we did a whole episode on DEI in the last one. It's episode 44.
I feel like you talked about diversity quite a bit if they go back to like season 2. So
yeah. So you said you wanted to focus on this new department that's like headed by Elon Musk, who is not a government official.
I mean, he kind of is. He's just not elected. But like the thing with Elon Musk, I've written about this in like my Wired article. He's doing pretty much the same things most wealthy people, very wealthy people do in controlling things. But like they usually don't like to be in the spotlight. But because again, he's a stunt queen, like he likes the spotlight. But I think sometimes people focus on Elon Musk too much. That's not to say that he's like not annoying and not smug and like doesn't have a punchable face and all these things. He does. But again, he's just doing the same thing that, John D. Rockefeller did, or JP Morgan did, or, Andrew Carnegie did. Like they use their wealth to like control governments and bend it and get it to do things that they want it to do for them. So that's not new. So like I think sometimes we need to stop focusing so much on the individuals and like think about the broader kind of structural context in which they're operating. So with that being said, like what's the deal with D.O.G.E? So D.O.G.E, so if you go to the website is so unserious. Like it's all a whole bunch of like Donald Trump and Elon Musk memes and stuff. It's so ridiculous. But really what they're doing isn't necessarily that different than like kind of what's been done over the last like 50 years. And so, okay, so like what is this the deal with? Like why do they want to cut all this stuff? Like essentially they want to cut, I think, $2.5 trillion from the budget by July 4th, 2026, which is the 250-year anniversary of America. 1776, 2026, 250 years. So they want to cut $2.5 trillion, I believe, by that date. Now, why do they want to cut $2.5 trillion by that date? So I think there's a few reasons. So on the one hand, the United States does have a huge amount of like some really big questions about essentially how does it pay for the things that it does. So the Wall Street Journal has had a really interesting article that came out, and I'll give you the link to it and you can post it. But like that really interesting article that came out maybe last month that was essentially looking at like how government spends its money. So like this can get, so I'm not a budgetary expert. So like, and there's a lot of like really technical details and stuff. So I'm going to skirt over all that because that's not really germane to what I'm saying. But like essentially there's discretionary government spending and non-discretionary government spending. So like what's considered non-discretionary government spending? So these are things that are typically called entitlements. So these are things that the government is on the hook for paying for. Like you have to figure out a way to cover it somehow. So like this includes like Social Security is considered an entitlement. It's non-discretionary, like it has to be paid for. Now, what they've tried to do to Social Security is essentially starve it of resources, or essentially find ways to like get fewer people to be able to like take advantage of the program under the guise that it doesn't have enough money to be like solvent for much longer, which I'm just like, you could easily fix that. So that's not a policy question, it's political. But like Social Security is one. I think Medicare is considered a non-discretionary item. So like that has to be covered. Again, they find ways to try to like tweak at the margins, but like those things have to be funded. Now, defense is technically considered discretionary, but it's treated as non-discretionary in the sense that both parties have accepted that you cannot touch defense. Like that's off the table. Like doesn't matter the fact that defense is the most wasteful organization out of all of them. Like Republicans and Democrats alike have agreed. There's a tacit agreement that you cannot touch defense. Okay, so you can't touch defense. You can't touch Social Security. You can't touch Medicare. So, okay, where are you going to cut if you can't touch? So you have to go to discretionary spending. So like what's considered discretionary spending? So those are going to be pretty much everything that's not that. So like pretty much any agency you can think of. And so like really what they're doing is like plowing the discretionary category for where they can cut. So that's like education,
environment,
EPA, all of that. Anything that I just didn't mention is considered discretionary. Right. Now, one would say, well, why is spending on education discretionary? I'm like, okay, that's a political question. There's nothing in nature that made it that way. Like, that's just what we have collectively decided. Maybe not us, but like that's what our forebears decided. And so we're kind of living in this era where, what do you do? The last part I forgot. So like the other part that's really important is the interest on the debt, the interest on government debt. So we know the United States is heavily indebted. Okay, what does that mean? So that means that the United States is on the hook for not only servicing its debt, but also paying the interest to the people that have lent the United States government money. So like, who are these people that have lent? So you have
billionaires.
So there's individual investors, but a lot of it is in what's called institutional investors. So like if you have a 401k, some of your 401k is probably invested in government bonds. So like there's that, but there's also like all foreign investors. So like, maybe the government of this nation or whatever. All of these people are the entities, all these institutions kind of have lent money to the United States with the expectation that they'll be paid back with interest, as is the case if anybody invests their money, they expect the interest on it. So like to pay the bondholders, so these are government bonds. So to pay the bondholders, essentially what Trump said was, okay, well, to ensure that we can pay the bondholders, we've agreed to engage in what's called austerity. So I've talked about austerity before, but let me explain what that means. So austerity is this idea that, well, if you're going to service your debt, if you're going to be more like financially sound, you essentially have two options. You could either raise taxes. Now, some people will say, well, taxes, the government, America's sovereign, like it can print its own money. It's true. But like, again, this is politics, not policy. So like, essentially you either have to raise taxes or you have to cut. And so like, obviously rich people ain't paying more in taxes. Poor people can't pay more in taxes. The middle class actually shoulders a lot of that. So like with the Trump tax cuts in 2017, those are really regressive in the sense that they shifted a lot of the tax burden from wealthy people and corporations, and kind of let expire a lot of the like tax subsidies that like middle class people. So there was kind of a very aggressive kind of tax policy there. But it was done. But because of that, now we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that the bondholders are like, well, how are you going to pay us? And then we're like, well, the only way we can do that, absent raising taxes, is cutting. So like that's really what they're doing right now. But this isn't new per se, in the sense that most governments have done this since at least the late 70s. So it really starts with like Jimmy Carter. He's really the first president that kind of starts speaking this language of austerity. Obviously, Ronald Reagan is very much an advocate of that. But the president that I think is the most who created this kind of framework that Trump was able to like build upon was Bill Clinton. So I've been reading this book. It's called Reinventing Government: How the Entrepreneurial Spirit is Transforming the Public Sector. It was a national bestseller, endorsed by Bill Clinton. One of the authors of the book, David Osborne, was Al Gore's advisor. And so like I've been reading this book because I think gives you a good sense into like how these things aren't new. And essentially what they've argued is that, what needs to happen is government needs to be more efficient, in the sense that it needs to be more entrepreneurial. And by that, they mean people need to be more creative in like how money is spent and like how government functions. And if we do that, then in the long term, will make government work better for everyone. Now, I think this is interesting because they use the term efficiency, and what is D.O.G.E called? Department of Government Efficiency. So if you read a lot of what's going on with D.O.G.E, it's very similar to what was being espoused in this, again, which was very instrumental in Bill Clinton's, especially his first presidency, our first administration. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of what's happening is actually kind of a long-standing trend that's been going on for the last, like, at least 40 years, probably closer to 50. But the thing that I think has people in a tizzy is that most politicians don't like to publicly announce that they're engaging in austerity, because they'll get this reaction from people like, oh my God, you're cutting all these jobs and you're cutting all these services and you're cutting. Again, most governments rather just kind of like to let things just like slide off of the ledger without much publicity, because they're politicians, because they're concerned about their reputations and like presenting themselves in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. But like, again, Trump likes the spotlight. And so like, unlike any other president, he's not gonna, he embraces people discussing these things because he likes to be seen, and we like to give him the attention that he craves. And so, yeah, I don't think that this is necessarily anything new. I think it might be a little bit more like the question might be a question of magnitude, like how, like maybe this is how much they're trying to cut in a short span of time might be new. But the ideas themselves are not new. They've been bipartisan. Both parties have adopted them. And part of the reason Trump was elected, and part of the reason he got so much support from Silicon Valley, private equity, is because of the two candidates, he was much clearer about like how much he was going to cut and how fast. Whereas Kamala, there was a really good article in the Financial Times where they were essentially discussing, what Kamala's austerity plan was going to be. And she was like, we're still trying to figure it out. I'm still working with, my advisors to see where we can cut and things. But she was equivocating too much. And the rich people were like, yeah, no, like Trump is saying he's going to cut on day one. Like, we already know, like, you're not telling us your plan. And so like, we're going to fund him because you're not giving us the plan. So Kamala was going to cut too, not because she's evil or anything, because again, like both parties have agreed that austerity is pretty much the only answer to deal with the question of how do you pay the bondholders and service the debt. Now, before I go any further, I must say that none of this has to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way.
It sounds like it doesn't.
It doesn't have to be this way. But it has to be this way if we continue to live under capitalism, because the only way that you can continue to have capitalism is if you can, essentially, if the country can service its debt. Because if America stops servicing its debt, the whole edifice of global capitalism would be called into question. And, as the global, hegemon, like you can't have that. You can't be claim to be the leader of global capitalism and then not agree to service your debt. Like it's too destabilizing, and it would take the veneer kind of off of the system. And so like they can't have that. And so like as a result, people here have to suffer because we're told that there's no alternative. Like cuts have to be made, we have to tighten our belts. They'll use like what they like to use is like the household metaphor. So they'll be like, yeah, if you have, when households are, planning their budgets, they have to make hard choices. So like maybe we wanted to go on this trip this year, but now we can't because, we have to make smart decisions and be like practical about how we spend our money. And like, again, America is it does not operate the same way as a household. But like that metaphor, I think, resonates with people in some sense. But what ends up happening is that we think about these things abstractly until we start to feel them directly. So last thing I'll say is I think part of the reason, so I don't know about you, but like it's been really interesting to me that that cities, especially in the north, have had such a hard time dealing with snow. Like they panic anytime we have like 3 or 4 inches of snow. And I'm just like, okay, like what's going on? And I think part of it is because of austerity. In other words, local governments don't have the resources to deal with like the disruptions that natural disasters, even snowstorms, bring, because they have had to lay off people because, again, local governments really struggle the most because when the federal government cuts back on spending, that trickles all the way down to local politics because local governments and state governments depend very heavily upon federal government to fund a lot of their basic operations. And so when that happens, like local governments really have to roll back a lot of services that people take for granted. And so I think part of the reason that you see all of this like hysteria around like snow and stuff is because cities know they don't have the capacity to deal with disruptions like that. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the monetary resources, they don't have the machinery that they used to have, or if they do, it's outdated and run down. These are all the social implications of austerity. And so I'm always trying to get people to like not take these things for granted because they don't have to be this way. And I want the news will talk about these things like it has to be this way. The cuts have to be made, but they don't have to.
I mean, there's so many different questions I have from this. First, I just feel like it almost feels like a losing game. Like, first, I just think, okay, America's like this greatest country in the world, but we're in all this debt. So, what does that look like to, like, say someone has, you think they have it all together, but really they're in shitload of debt. That just feels like what America is. And then it feels like we're basically in an oligarch society.
Oligarch?
Yeah. Like, it just feels like, I mean, since what, the 60s, 70s, or maybe we've always been, I don't know, but it just seemed like rich people really do like just make the rules for us. Like, and it's just crazy how a lot of people vote against their like priority, like they'll cut off their nose to spite their face. Because you're just saying like how like tax cuts for the wealthy, I mean, doesn't that affect everybody under them? But you would think they would vote, like, since there's a majority of people who are not wealthy, you think they would vote in for the other side and not Republicans. It just feels like a lot of this should be common sense.
Well, the thing is, like, as I've said before, we have short-term memory, but I think historically, so I think the way we should be thinking, like, I think I tweeted about this some time ago. I was like, we think in terms of like years and like even decades, but really we should be thinking in terms of centuries. So like the America we're living in now is the America that was built in like 1917, essentially. Like we're still living in that version of America and still dealing with the consequences of decisions that were made then. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. And so I think there's a lot of misapprehension about like what's going on because again, both parties have agreed to austerity as like a policy, as a way of like organizing the political economy. Both of them agree that the cuts have to be made. They differ they agree on the substance. They just differ on the means. But my whole thing is like, okay, if you're going to kill me by stabbing me or kill me by shooting me, like, does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? And so like, I think Americans are like, well, it's kind of like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I would say, well, yes, in this two-party, that's part of why we have a two-party system. It's just like, it kind of forecloses anything outside of that of that equation, which is why anytime there is a potential third party, candidate emerging, both parties do whatever they can to try to like extinguish, because that disrupts the again, there's a tacit agreement between Republicans. And so, as I mentioned before, both parties have accepted that defense is off the table, and any type of like significant transformations to the capitalist economy are off the table. So like if you agree, if you take those two things off the table, which are kind of to me the two most imperialism and capitalism, to me that seems like the most relevant things that would impact people on a daily basis, then like what else is there to fight over? Like where does the disagreement come in? And I think part of the reason you have so much like culture war, that's what they call it, culture war, is because the culture war is what happens when both parties have essentially accepted that they are not going to allow debates in those realms. They're not going to allow people to discuss capitalism or imperial. Like that has to be taken for granted. And so I think for a lot of people, most people are just like, well, fuck it. Like it doesn't matter who I vote for. Like I'm still gonna get screwed either way. Now and then we get into the question of like the lesser evilism, which I'm always like, that's not really helpful to think about. Now the question will be like, well, which party is better with like harm reduction? I typically think harm reduction as a framework is a little silly for reasons I won't get into now. Y'all can drag me in the comments, but I just think that neither party is going to reduce harm. Like if anything, they might slow the rate of harm, but they're not going to reduce it like that. And it's not because they're actively trying to harm people. It's because they've essentially accepted that, it sucks, but like, some people just have to be poor. Some people just have to struggle. Like
it's terrible.
It's not in like it's just a very cynical outlook. And like both parties are very cynical. Like I think in that cynicism, I think has bled into American public opinion. So there's an interesting book I would highly recommend you read called Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann. And Walter Lippmann was probably the most prominent intellectual of like the early 20th century. So he wrote a lot in like the 20s and 30s. But essentially what he argued was that, Americans these things are too complex for Americans to understand. They're not going to understand capitalism. They're not going to understand, our imperial endeavors and why we're doing these things. They just need to know that we are doing what's best for America. Now, of course, what you think is the best for America is itself a political question, because what I think is best for some may not be what you think. But they essentially were of the view that these issues were too complex for regular Americans to understand, and so they needed to be kept out of the fray. And so like the way you do that is essentially through like propaganda. And so like you tell people like what you feel like you need to know, and so you don't have to deal with them essentially getting in the way of like the experts and the elites running what they call it, the responsible men running things. And so that's an idea that I think kind of is still dominant today. Like political elites and politicians are like, shut up and let us do our jobs. We're going to do our best. Now, you can't guarantee that it's not going to mean that some of y'all might have to suffer, but you can be sure that like we're doing what's best for the country. It's just that what's best for the country is what's best for them first and foremost. And if there's anything left over, then so be it. But I don't think it's in like a malicious way. Like some of it, yeah, but like by and large, I think they actually think that what they're doing is right, which in some respects is worse, because it's one thing to be like, yeah, we're shafting you, like too bad, too sad, get over it. But it's another thing to be like, yeah, we're adopting these policies, which we know they'll say like, we have to take our medicine. That's the language they like to use. Like that's what the Federal Reserve will say. They will be like, yeah, well, we have to have this inflation because wages are too high, and so we need to get wages down. And so like essentially it's going to be tough, Like, there's gonna be their language. There's gonna be a hard landing. This is their actual language. It's gonna be a hard landing. It's gonna cause a lot of pain for a lot of people, but we don't really have any other choice. We'll just try to get through it as best we can. And hopefully people don't suffer too much. Of course, they never suffer, but again, like the expectation. But they believe in meritocracy, so like their whole thing is like, well, yeah, we got to rule the things because we deserved it. We worked hard and got here, and so like we are entitled to the things we are trying to do. But like we're just gonna try to make sure it doesn't harm people too much. But we can't promise you that.
Right. I guess last thing I'm gonna say is like I feel like if they think Americans, like you said, from the public opinion, like how Americans just don't really like understand this information. I think if we were educated enough, like if we were taught this, I feel like more people would be involved.
Yeah, but they don't want more people involved. They want people to be Walter. Let me see the exact. Hold on, I'm going to tell you the exact. Hold on, I have to read this quote verbatim. So Walter Lippmann, this is a direct quote. He says, hold on, it's from Public Opinion. He says, the public must be put in its place so that each of us may live free of the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd.
All right.
So yeah, they don't want people to be, because their idea is that it's just too complex for like the average human brain to get these things. And so that's why you need the best in brain. It's called technocracy. I really wish people and politicians spoke like they did in like the 20s. Most of my research is like in the mid 20th century. So I read a lot of stuff from like the 20s and the 30s, the 40s, pretty much the 20s to like the 70s. That's kind of like where I've been doing a lot of my reading the last few years, working on my book. And they're much more open about these things. They're just like, people are dumb. Americans have two other things to focus on. They're never going to understand the complexities of macroeconomic policy or like geopolitics or any of these things. And so like, we just need to make sure they stay out of the way, give them what they need to know, the propaganda. Hopefully the economy is good enough so they can shop and be distracted and like, go to these shows and things and stay out of the way. Let us do our bidding. Let us do what we have to do to make sure that things, stay together. And then hopefully we can do our jobs well enough so that, there isn't a situation where, there is an economic downturn, because then they're really going to be harmed. So we're doing this for y'all. Like, this is for y'all. This is in y'all's best interest to just shut up, get out of the way, let us do our jobs as well as we can so that we can ensure that there isn't any economic downturn. Because if there is one, y'all are going to suffer the most. And so like, if y'all don't want to suffer, y'all need to just be quiet and like, let us do our jobs. I'm not endorsing this view. I think it's ridiculous, but that's really how political elites think. That's how they have thought. I think that's how a lot of Americans think. I think I work in the academy, and there is a disdain for like working people that is long-standing in American history. And I'm always like, okay, we're gonna blame other working people. So I always get frustrated when I see people blaming other working people for stuff. And I'm just like, okay, they're right there. Like, you don't have to like why is nobody blaming Jamie Dimon? But anyway, so yeah, that's all.
Sounds like farmers herding sheep. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, we could talk about this ad nauseum. I feel like we've hit our time today.
Wow, that was quick.
I know, it really does go by fast. We can have like a mini series on capitalism, equality, etc. But anyway,
maybe we should do like a mini series on like the historical development of capitalism over the last in one episode. I just break it down and like build up to like how we got here, because I think there's a lot of misapprehensions, a lot of misunderstandings about like what capitalism is. I have another paper I'm working on where I essentially implore people to stop using capitalism as a pejorative, stop using it as just a negative buzzword, because that's not really helpful. Like, I think we have to understand like what is capitalism, and like when I'm always saying we have to get beyond it, like what does that mean? So like maybe down the line sometime we can have like a little mini series or something.
Because I know you will start from the 1700s to now.
Yeah, I would. And I think you have to start there if you really want to understand. Really, you should start a little bit earlier, probably like the Magna Carta, but like I'll be fair and start in like the 1700s.
Yeah, I do think I would love the next episode to be a Q&A because I feel like we haven't done that in a while. So, we have 65 people in the room. So later on, probably next week, make sure y'all come back and we'll just have a big Q&A across all the episodes we've done so far. So yeah, that'll be the next episode, y'all. And with that, make sure y'all follow Jared. You see his handle on Twitter and Instagram, and also his blog is also in the description below as well.
Yes, I actually have a post I'm working on now, like trying to explain essentially what I just said about all these cuts and things in much more thoroughly. It's just taking me a little bit longer to do that, and I've had so many other things working on, but it's coming. Right. So make sure you're subscribed.
Yes. All right, y'all. So make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see y'all for the next episode.